We just watched a terrific documentary, just a short part of it, about how wolves changed the ecosystem in Yellowstone National Park in the United States. And what it showed was a top-down change. Wolves are the top predators. They're the top of the food chain in Yellowstone Park. They were hunted to extinction. The whole park changed because without the wolves, the elk increased in numbers, that the elk ate much of the vegetation as well as the deer ate much of the vegetation. So it ended up changing that ecosystem quite a bit. When wolves were reintroduced, it changed the ecosystem almost back to what it was before. So that is control from the trophic level above, in this case, the top of the food chain, which is the wolves. And long-term experiments have shown that communities can shift periodically from bottom up to top down. So bottom up kinds of control on an ecosystem or on a food chain or a food web is usually because of primary productivity. Primary productivity is affected by nutrients in the soil, it's affected by sunlight and by rain. So that can also affect the trophic levels above. So there can be a switch from one to the other. In this case, it shows rainfall on the x-axis and percentage of plant cover on the y-axis. And it shows that with these two elements, the communities have changed their composition. Some communities are affected by pollution that may be present. So if you're living close to an urban area, for example, rivers can be quite affected by use of highways and by drainage. Mines can affect land and water by tailings and other kinds of chemicals. So it can affect community dynamics, but nowadays, sometimes we can do biomanipulation similar to the wolves, but in this case, instead of from the top down, we're changing the system from the bottom up, and biomanipulation. Yeah, so we might, in this case, be removing the pollution which is affecting the primary producers. In the polluted state, we might have abundant fish, rare zooplankton, but abundant algae. You know, if the polluted state includes lots of nutrients from, say, a sugarcane farm or a golf course. Golf courses have an enormous amount of fertilizer, and those provide nutrients to local streams. But a stream can be restored, or any system can be restored, if the components are there to start with, of course, and it may be restored to its former condition. A disturbance is an event that changes a community. It can remove organisms and it can alter resource availability. And that's a disturbance in an ecosystem. So there's different kinds of disturbances. There's local disturbances. They may be local disturbances. They may be broader disturbances that are quite large. So it might include something like a volcano. That would be quite a large disturbance, of course. Fires can be very large disturbances. Or it might just be a tree falling, a small disturbance. Fire can be quite a significant disturbance in the ecosystem. Sometimes fires are set on purpose because there's been fire suppression for such a long time. So one thing that we do as humans is we do tend to suppress fires, but what can happen, as in this grassland here, this is a prairie land, not burned for several years. It might be because it's been suppressed by humans, or it might just not have burned for several years. But what happens is that the grass dies, the detritus forms, and the grassland may be mostly dead grass. In this case, there was a controlled burn, and the detritus served as a fuel for those fires. After the burn, about a month, all of the biomass in the prairie was living. So there was no longer an abundance of detritus. So fire can change an ecosystem. In some cases, fire is necessary. It's a necessity. For example, in British Columbia, in our interior and some places on the coast, there is a tree known as a lodgepole pine. It also is called a shore pine in some cases. And it requires fire to open and germinate the cones. So some of the cones, they require fire. So fire is not always a man-made thing or a human-induced thing. Sometimes fires occur quite naturally by mostly lightning. And the ecosystems have been subject to fires for a long time, and as such have evolved to resist or adapt to the fires. So fires are a periodic thing in many different kinds of ecosystems. So for example, in British Columbia, in the temperate rainforest, you would expect any given stand of trees would experience a fire every 300, 350 years. However, so temperate rainforest, may experience, on average, every 300 to 350 years, on average. But during this time, there hasn't been an enormous amount of fallen leaves and fallen branches and fallen trees that have dried. So if you suppress fires for a long time, then a lot of that fuel can accumulate. And when there is a fire, it causes a very large fire. So that's why in some places, fires tend to go out of control. But these fires that occur every 300, 350 years, they are fires that remove dead branches and litter from the forest floor, but leave the big trees. So Douglas fir, for example, one of our local trees, is very resistant to fire. It's really thick bark. There's a hypothesis known as the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, where moderate levels of disturbance foster higher species diversity. So an example of that is such. Say you have a community of trees, and there are also a few shrubs, but there's a fire or some other disturbance, and some of those trees end up falling or they disappear for one reason or another, and then other species can move in for that reason. So now you have more species diversity. That's called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. That means not a huge disturbance like a fire that will wipe everything out, but small disturbances that occur periodically. Some examples of human disturbance are introductions. So in British Columbia, there's many introductions of different species. One of note is purple loosestrife. That is a weedy species. And it's invasive. It has no predators locally. Therefore, it outcompetes local species. It's also just very good at dispersal. So purple loosestrife is one. What's another one? Let's see. Scotch broom. That's a yellow flowering shrub that's all over Vancouver Island. That's an introduced species. Another one is a starling, of course. Land clearing is another form of disturbance, and it could be by forestry, it could be fire, it could be development. Forestry may be restored, but an old growth forest to restore would take 1,000+ years, because some of our old growth trees in our old growth forest, which is very little left in British Columbia, they are 1,000 to 5,000 years old. And we also clear by fire. So sometimes we clear areas purposefully to grow different species. But there can be restoration after fires. And development. So development usually is there to stay. So it doesn't usually revert back to any other kind of ecosystem. So the idea of succession is thus that after a disturbance, like fire or clearing, there's a sequence of community and ecosystem changes. In primary succession, that occurs where there is no soil at all. So the disturbance is large, like a volcano or something large. Leaving bare rock. Deglaciation, or glaciers retreating, is also such a disturbance. There's no soil. Secondary succession occurs when there's soil present. So that is where land is cleared for crops or by fire. And there is a seed bank. That means a variety of seeds from the plants that were living there in the soil. After a disturbance, the early arriving species, also known as pioneer species, they may facilitate later species by, say, making soil. They may inhibit later species by, say, producing an acidic soil, or they may simply tolerate later species and then they live together in that area. So this is Glacier Bay in Alaska, and it shows that glaciers were here in the 1700s. They've retreated, and they've retreated more, and they've retreated quite a bit more. I don't have the most recent map, but it is continuing to retreat, but it also has been very well studied. And it seems that in Glacier Bay in Alaska, the pioneer stage is fireweed. And fireweed is a very hardy species. Hardy species. It fixes nitrogen. It has bacteria that fix nitrogen in its roots. So it can live on nutrient-poor soil. But it increases the nutrient richness by adding nitrogen itself, usable nitrogen. The next stage is called the driest stage. That's a kind of shrub. And the soil is now rich enough for the dryas to live there. The dryas changes the soil even more. When the spruce move in, that's the last stage, when the spruce move in, they will shade out much of the dryas. So will shade out other species. And they will end up being the climax species of that area. So in succession, so this was an example of primary succession. But there are some pieces missing. Before fireweed can get into an area like this, there has to be some soil present. So in primary succession, where there's bare rock, it's lichens that move in first. Lichens are first. Lichens are a fungi and an algae that live in a mutual arrangement. The algae photosynthesizes and produces sugar. For the fungi, and the fungi produces a home and access to sunlight, but also nutrients, minerals from its own waste. The second species will likely be mosses, because mosses need very little soil. By this time, the lichens have died, and there has been some soil produced by the death of the lichens, but also by the erosion of the rock. And so mosses move in, there's further erosion. Sometimes the next species are ferns or other small shrubs, then maybe larger shrubs, and then hardwood trees. Those are deciduous trees like alder, and then conifers. That would be primary succession. Secondary succession, the ensuing diversity will be due to the seeds that are present. And the order in which they occur, it all depends on the species that are present. You might have noticed in our past discussions that there is a real difference between the polar regions, up here in the Northern Hemisphere, for example, compared to the equator. So for example, in the tropics, let's say, no, wait, in a tropical forest, there may be 250 species of tree in 1 hectare. But in a temperate forest, there may be 10 to 12 species. So considerably less, fewer species. The reason for that is thought to be evolutionary history and climate. So climate is not limiting, particularly water, sunlight is not limiting. in the tropics. And also the tropics have not been covered in ice as often. So here in BC was covered in ice, which retreated between 15,000 to 12,000 years ago. So that's not a long time for species to diverge or for there to be speciation. So our species came from refuges in BC where there wasn't any ice. There were a couple of those. From the south and from the ocean. So the climate factors correlated with diversity are solar energy and water. Here's a couple of graphs to show that. In this case, the y-axis is tree species richness going up, and the x-axis is evapotranspiration, which is a measure of the amount of water available and the amount of sunlight, since sunlight evaporates water. And it shows that generally, this is a best fit curve here, shows that generally species diversity increases with solar input and water. And the same is the case here for vertebrates. Here's a vertebrate species. On the y-axis, evapotranspiration. So the vertebrates also increase. Although the species that, the vertebrate species, they won't increase indefinitely because they are restricted by space. They generally need to have more space per species. There is a concept called a species area curve that quantifies the idea that if everything else is the same, soil, water, sunlight, etc., then the larger the geographic area, the greater the number of species. And that has been shown. This is just one. There's many species area curves of organisms. In this case, it's a North American breeding birds. This is the number of species here, and this is the number of acres. So with an increase in area, you get more species of birds. And that makes sense because more space opens up. And I think that's where I wanted to end off. Yeah, I wanted to end there. This was a makeup lecture because I didn't record the previous one. So thank you for watching.